I'm Meredith Lane, 33 years old, and for most of my life I believed if I just gave a little more time, more love, more effort, maybe my parents would finally see me. I spent hours choosing their anniversary gift this year. Something meaningful, something that said I still cared. I even picked out a card hand-embossed with gold lettering and signed it with the kind of words you only write when you're still holding on. But when I called to say I wanted to come early and help set up, my father told me not to come. Not angrily, just flat and final. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been pushed aside by the people you called family. I was born in Springfield, Missouri, the second daughter of a pastor and a part-time bookkeeper. We didn't have much growing up, but my parents were proud of their values. Honesty, humility, faith. They preached those things like scripture, and I believed every word. I was the quiet one, the helper, the one who brought home good grades and packed her sister's lunch when Mom was too tired. My older sister Danielle had a louder presence. She was charming and magnetic, the kind of person who could walk into a room and pull attention without trying. And somehow over the years, my parents began orbiting around her. Not maliciously. It just shifted. Her mistakes were forgiven with laughter. My efforts were noticed, then forgotten. After high school, Danielle stayed close to home, eventually managing a boutique downtown. I took a different route. I left for college in Denver, then moved to Seattle to work in clean energy. I built a name for myself quietly, slowly. I didn't come home often, but when I did, I brought gifts, covered dinners, and always asked how everyone was doing. I never bragged, never explained too much about my job, even though I co-founded the very company people now talked about on the evening news. Still, every time I visited, I saw myself a little less in the photo albums. One year, my name was misspelled on my birthday cake. The next, they forgot to send a card. But I kept showing up, hoping each time just maybe it would be different. That's why this year I picked out that clock. I had it custom made by a local artist, a soft walnut frame, delicate hands, and our last name etched in cursive across the face. I thought maybe it would remind them of who we used to be. I wrapped it carefully, folded the card, and called Mom. She picked up on the second ring. I heard the usual clatter in the background, probably dishes in the sink, and then her voice soft but guarded. I said, "Hey, Mom, I was thinking I could come a few days early, help set up for the anniversary." There was a pause. Then came a breathy chuckle. "Oh, Meredith." That was when Dad cut in. His voice was steady, no hesitation. "It's better if you don't come this year." I didn't answer right away. I stood in my kitchen phone, pressed to my ear, watching rain bead down the window pane. I asked why, my voice barely above a whisper. "Danielle's bringing someone important," Mom said. "We just don't want too much going on." Important. Not me. Never me. They didn't yell. They didn't hang up in anger. But when the call ended, the silence in my house felt louder than it had in years. I set the phone next to the wrapped gift and card on my kitchen table. The rain kept falling. Somewhere across town, they were planning a celebration. And for the first time, I wondered if I'd ever really been invited in the first place. I didn't sleep much that night. The rain had eased into a slow drizzle, but the house felt heavy, as if it had absorbed every unspoken word from that call. I left the gift and the card on the table untouched the same way they had left me. The next morning, I made coffee out of habit, then let it sit on the counter until it went cold. I picked up my phone sometime around mid-morning, half hoping for a message. Nothing. I scrolled through a few updates, not really looking for anything, just letting my thumb move. That's when I saw the photo. It was my mother's post. A wide white canopy stretched across a neatly manicured backyard, tables dressed in cream linens, candles flickering in glass holders, fairy lights strung like stars across the ceiling. At the center of it all, my sister Danielle smiling in a champagne-colored dress, holding the clock I had commissioned, the one I spent weeks choosing, the one with our last name etched into the base. I stared at it for a long time before I realized I wasn't breathing. The caption read, "So thoughtful of Danielle to organize such a beautiful day. We're so proud of her." There was no mention of me. Not my name, not a thank you, not even a hint of the person who chose that clock or wrote the card, now likely thrown in the trash. I kept scrolling. Another photo, more smiles, more thanks to Danielle. Then the comments began. "She always knows how to make an event shine. Your daughter's amazing." And beneath it, a few colder lines from people I barely knew. "She didn't even show up. Some folks can't handle being outshined. Thought she'd at least call." Each one landed like a quiet slap. Not dramatic, just enough to sting. I set the phone down and walked to the sink, turned the water on cold, let it run over my hands until they numbed. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. I just needed something to feel real. The tile beneath my feet, the cold porcelain, the sting in my fingers. Because everything else, the family I thought I had, the place I believed I still held it, had slipped away so quietly I didn't even notice until it was gone. 3 days ago, I was wrapping a clock in soft paper, tying a ribbon with steady hands. I was writing a card in neat script, believing someone would read it and feel what I meant. And now they weren't just moving on without me. They were rewriting the story entirely. My gift, my effort, my presence gone, erased like it was never there. That afternoon passed in pieces. I moved around the house without doing much. I folded laundry I didn't need to fold, wiped down the counters twice, stared out the window at nothing in particular. By early evening, the sky shifted to a pale blue. I sat back down at the table where everything had started. The clock was gone from my hands, but I still felt the weight of it, not in my arms, just in my chest. I pulled my phone close again, not to look for messages. I just wanted to see the photos one more time, like if I stared at them long enough, the truth would shift. But it didn't. The comments kept piling up. The compliments, the quiet accusations. Somewhere along the line, I had become the selfish one, the bitter daughter, the no-show who couldn't be bothered to attend her own parents' celebration. It wasn't just that I wasn't there. It was that they made it seem like I never tried, that I didn't care, that I had abandoned them. And Danielle, she smiled through it all like the clock had always belonged to her. The kitchen lights felt too bright, the room too clean. I turned them off and stood in the doorway, letting the soft gray of dusk settle in. For a while, I just listened. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak in the walls. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice, then quieted. I sat down on the living room floor back against the couch and stared at nothing. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't call anyone to ask why. I just let the quiet stay. Because somewhere in that stillness, I knew. I had lost them long before this party. This was just the first time they said it out loud. Later that night, I imagined what it would feel like to drive across town and walk into that party. What it would look like to see the guests turn glasses half raised. Danielle caught mid-sentence. I pictured the clock on the table, the gasp when they realized I wasn't so far away after all. I thought about doing it, just showing up. But I didn't move. Instead, I walked to the front window. From there, I could see the soft curve of rooftops' porch lights blinking on one by one. I stood there for a long time, arms crossed loosely, watching the world go on. At the party, somewhere beneath those fairy lights, my sister probably toasted again. Probably stood next to our parents while they smiled for more photos. Maybe someone asked about me. Maybe not. But in one quiet corner of that room, something small cracked. It started with a question one asked casually by my cousin Marlene while sipping a glass of wine. "Where's Meredith? Isn't she working at Pacific Terrace now?" My mother's smile held, but her voice didn't come right away. Danielle laughed, brushing her hair behind her ear. "She's doing her own thing," she said. "Very independent." And maybe that was enough for most of the room. But it wasn't enough for everyone. Not once the name Pacific Terrich came up again this time from someone new. Someone who didn't know he was about to break the story they'd spent years trying to tell. It was Danielle's boyfriend, Dorian. He lifted his champagne glass, grinning easily. "Crazy small world," he said. "Just started working at Terrich last month. My boss is incredible. Sharp, fair, tough when she needs to be. Meredith Lane. Honestly, the whole company kind of runs on her vision." And that's when the room went still. The room had been humming just moments before, glasses, clinking laughter, rising in little waves, the kind of light music that blends into the background without drawing attention. But after Dorian said my name, it all shifted, not loudly, just noticeably, like someone had turned the volume down on the whole evening without touching the dial. He was still smiling when he said it. "To Meredith Lane," he added, raising his glass again, not realizing the silence that followed had nothing to do with respect. He thought he was offering a compliment. He didn't see the way my father's fingers stiffened around the stem of his wine glass, or how my mother's smile tightened just a little too far at the edges. Danielle's hand landed on his arm light, at first then firmer, her knuckles whitening against the fabric of his sleeve. The group around them didn't know what to do. One person coughed. Another reached for their drink but didn't take a sip. You could hear the faint hum of the ceiling fan, the scrape of a fork against a plate. Nothing else. Dorian looked around, a little puzzled. What he said with a laugh, still casual. "She's really something. One of the best I've ever worked with." Aunt Marlene was the first to speak. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "Meredith Lane. The one from Pacific Terrich." She turned slightly toward my mother. "I thought she moved back here a while ago. Funny no one mentioned her tonight." There was a pause, just long enough for people to realize they hadn't asked. Then came the whispers. Not loud or dramatic, just low ripples. "Wait, she's the one who started that company. Didn't realize she was related. Why wouldn't they say something?" Danielle tried to recover. Her voice took on that soft, practiced tone she used when she needed things to go her way. "Oh, she's just very private. Keeps to herself these days. We don't see her much." Dorian frowned. Not harshly, just confused. "That's not really true," he said, turning toward her. "She's in the office almost every day. Board meetings, investor calls, product strategy, you name it." Then he looked back at the group. "She co-founded the company. It was basically her idea from the beginning." No one moved. For a moment, even the music seemed to pause. Danielle smiled again, but it was tight. "Well, she doesn't like to talk about work with us. You know how it is." Dorian didn't respond right away. He looked at her, really looked. Then he glanced at my parents, both of whom were still frozen in place. He set his glass down quieter this time. Somewhere near the dessert table, someone tried to change the subject, something about weather or weekend plans, but it didn't stick. Too many faces were still turned toward the center of the room. The carefully polished surface of the evening had cracked. And once people started looking, they noticed more. Not just what was said, but what wasn't. They saw the family photos hung on the wall, no sign of me. They remembered the speech my father gave earlier that night, where he thanked Danielle for being a rock through hard times. They thought back to the card from my mother where she called Danielle the heart of this family. And suddenly, questions floated in the air like dust in sunlight. At home, I didn't know any of this was happening. I was still sitting in my living room, the lamp beside me casting a soft glow across the rug. My phone was face down on the coffee table. I hadn't picked it up in hours. The quiet had settled into every corner of the room. But across town, the story they'd told about me, how distant I was, how unreliable, was coming apart. Not because I said anything, not because I showed up to defend myself, but because the truth had found its way into the room and it didn't ask for permission. Later that night, once most of the guests had filtered out and the music had been turned off, Danielle pulled Dorian aside. They stood near the kitchen, voices low, but not low enough to avoid being overheard. "Why would you say that?" she asked. "You embarrassed them." Dorian looked at her puzzled. "Embarrassed them how I was just being honest." She let out a soft sigh. "It's complicated. Things with Meredith. They've always been complicated." He was quiet for a moment. Then gently, "She doesn't talk about you that way. At the office, I mean." Danielle didn't answer. The rest of the night moved slowly. People left in small groups, their goodbyes a little shorter than usual. My father poured himself another drink and stood by the window for a long time. My mother started clearing plates without saying much. Danielle stayed quiet, her smile gone now, her movements careful. That night something shifted, not in the way people saw me, but in the way they saw them. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one being questioned. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that settles after a long rain. I didn't check my phone. I didn't reach for the news. I just sat at the edge of the bed, feet flat against the floor, hands resting on my knees. The silence didn't feel heavy this time. It felt clean. Downstairs, I moved through my routine without needing to think. Coffee brewed slow and steady. I opened the curtains just enough to let in the early gray light. Across the street porch, lights flicked off one by one as the neighborhood stirred. I sat at the kitchen table, same chair I'd used the night I wrapped that clock. This time there was nothing waiting on the table, just my mug warm in my hands. It had been 2 days since Dorian's name dropped into that party like a stone in still water. I hadn't heard from anyone. Not my mother, not my sister, not even one of the cousins who usually filled the group text with photos of dessert trays and centerpieces. But I didn't feel forgotten, not in the way I used to. There was something about that silence that carried weight. I went to work as usual. The building was quiet when I arrived, just before 8. I liked those early hours when the elevators were still and the city below hadn't quite woken up. My office overlooked the waterfront ferries gliding across the sound tugboats, carving slow trails through the water. On my desk, a folder waited neatly stacked. Staff reviews, contract bids, a few notes for the leadership summit next quarter. I reviewed them one by one, signing what needed signing, flagging what needed follow-up. Around 10, I saw Dorian in the hallway. He was walking out of a project team meeting, sleeves rolled up, tie tucked into his shirt pocket. He nodded when he saw me. "Morning, Meredith." I nodded back. "Everything all right on the Anderson file?" He smiled a little slower than usual. "Yeah, we're ahead of schedule. Just sorting through the specs now." There was a short pause, like he was deciding whether to say more. Then he cleared his throat. "By the way, I didn't mean to stir anything the other night." I met his eyes. "You didn't." He relaxed a little. "Okay, good. I just didn't realize." I gave a small nod and stepped aside so he could pass. He hesitated again, then walked on. Back in my office, I pulled the blinds halfway. The sunlight had started to break through the clouds. I sat down and let my hands rest on the desk fingers, lightly touching the grain of the wood. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't mapping out a response, but something had shifted in me. Not out of anger, just clarity, the version of myself who begged to be seen, who brought gifts, hoping for a seat at the table she didn't live here anymore. That evening after dinner, I went through my files at home. Not company files, family ones. I pulled up the automatic payments I'd been making for years. The ones no one ever asked about, not directly, but that always showed up on my accounts. The second mortgage I helped cover, the medical bills quietly taken care of. Even the little deposits I sent to Danielle's account every few months when she said work had slowed down. I didn't do it to be thanked. I did it because I thought that's what family meant. But now, looking at the numbers, I realized none of it had been acknowledged. Not once. I clicked open each one, paused, and began canceling. Not hurried, not dramatic, just one after another. I removed myself from their balance sheets like they'd removed me from their memories. The following morning, I drove into work earlier than usual. The city still smelled like rain. I parked, took the elevator up, and walked into a room full of department heads for the quarterly planning session. I greeted each one by name, reviewed the projections, laid out the next steps. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was steady. Later that day, I saw a new message on my phone. My mother. A voicemail, no text. I didn't open it right away. I set the phone down and walked into the break room, poured a cup of coffee, and stood for a moment at the window, watching the clouds roll across the sky. The world hadn't stopped. The story they told about me was beginning to unravel, not because I fought it, but because I no longer needed to. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything I'd built on my own. The envelope was slipped under my door sometime between dusk and full dark. I didn't hear the knock, just the faint scrape of paper against the floor as I passed by the hallway on my way to the kitchen. I bent down, picked it up, and turned it over in my hand. No return address. Just my name and handwriting I hadn't seen in years, loopy and quick, always leaning a little too far to the right. My mother's. Inside a single note. We know texting wasn't enough. Can we meet face to face? Just to talk. Love, Mom. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. I stood at the kitchen counter reading it twice. Then I folded it and set it beside the sink. I didn't answer that night. I went to bed like usual, brushed my teeth, locked the doors. But the letter stayed in my mind. Not the words themselves, just the way they came so quietly. No apology, no explanation, just a pull. The next morning I sent a message. All right, let's meet. I'll choose the place. I picked a little cafe near the center of town, neutral, clean, quiet, a place without any memories. I arrived early and chose a booth near the window. The tables were small, the wood worn smooth by years of elbows and coffee mugs. The smell of baked bread and espresso lingered in the air, soft and familiar. A server offered water. I nodded and folded my hands in front of me. They arrived 10 minutes later. My mother first, with a careful smile and a hand on her purse strap. Then my father in a pressed collared shirt, scanning the room like it might offer him a way out. Danielle followed behind, lips tight, avoiding my eyes. They sat down across from me without asking. "Hi, sweetheart," my mother said, voice quiet but warm. My father gave a stiff nod. "Good to see you." Danielle murmured a hello and looked down at her napkin. We didn't order anything. They started with small talk. My mother commented on the pastries. My father mentioned how long it had been since he came downtown. Danielle said something about work, how she was managing the store mostly on her own now. I listened, nodded once or twice. My water glass stayed full. Finally, my mother leaned forward, elbows resting on the edge of the table. "Meredith, we just want to move past all this. Things got twisted." My father cleared his throat. "We've all made mistakes. But holding on to bitterness doesn't help anyone. Family's too important for that." Danielle added quickly, "People talk, they stir things up. You know how that goes." I waited until they finished. Then I said, "If you're sorry, say it. Out loud. In front of the people you lied to." The words weren't sharp, just steady, the kind of steady that doesn't waver when it's finally tired of bending. The table went quiet. My mother blinked fast. Honey, there's no need to make a public scene. My father glanced at his watch. It's not about dragging things up again. Danielle gave a little shrug. Nobody's thinking about that night anymore. Everyone's moved on. I looked at them, one by one, and I realized something I should have understood long before. They weren't here to make it right. They were here to smooth it over. I set my napkin down and stood slowly. My voice was calm. I'm done crossing lines to stay in rooms that never wanted me. A few heads turned. I didn't notice who. I didn't need to. I walked out the door, shutting behind me with a quiet click. The air outside was cooler than I expected, and for a moment I just stood on the sidewalk breathing it in. I didn't rush to the car. I didn't look back through the window. By the time I reached the corner, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees above. I tucked my hands into my pockets and turned toward home. The night after that cafe meeting, I didn't turn on the TV or music when I got home. I dropped my keys on the entry table, hung my coat, and walked straight to the den. The soft glow from the desk lamp was enough. I didn't need anything louder than that. My laptop was where I'd left it. I opened it slowly, the way you open a drawer you haven't looked in for years. I signed in, pulled up the folders I'd kept out of habit. No urgency, just a quiet certainty in my hands as I began clicking through. First was the monthly transfer to my parents' second mortgage. It had started as a temporary favor during a rough patch, at least that's what they called it back then. Somehow, it never stopped. I opened the account settings and canceled it. Confirmed. Next, the medical premiums, the ones that covered extras their plan didn't handle. Physical therapy, dental crowns, prescription refills. Things my father never acknowledged, but that kept showing up in the statements anyway. I removed my payment method and saved the change. Then, Danielle's name. Her rainy day fund had a neat little auto transfer I'd set up for her after she broke her wrist and missed work for 6 weeks. She never turned it off. I had almost forgotten about it until I saw her balance screen light up across mine. I ended that too. Just a click and a confirmation. I didn't feel angry, just clear, like wiping condensation off a mirror. I went back through everything twice just to be sure. I logged out, closed the laptop, sat back in the chair and looked around the room. It had always been quiet in here, wood floors, high bookshelves, the soft tick of the wall clock. Tonight it felt different, like the room was waiting for me to catch up with myself. I stayed there until the clock struck midnight. The next day at the office, things moved like usual. Staff checked in a vendor, called about a supply delay. Dorian passed by my door and gave a quick wave. I stayed focused. I met with our legal team about an upcoming contract. I reviewed a proposal for a partnership with the city. My inbox was full, but none of it felt heavy. It wasn't until just after lunch that the messages started again. First, a text from my cousin Rachel. Heard about the fallout. Don't let the family stuff mess with your work. You're doing great. Then an email from an old friend of my mother's, someone I hadn't seen since high school church picnics. She wrote a paragraph about Grace, then slipped in a line about not forgetting who helped you when you had nothing. Another message came in that evening, this time from a former teacher, Mrs. Brandt, who had always loved Danielle. She'd posted something on her public page, no names, but it didn't take much to know who she meant. Something about grown children forgetting their roots and how success doesn't cancel out gratitude. I didn't answer any of them. That night, I stayed late at the office. I wasn't hiding. I just needed the quiet. The parking lot was mostly empty by the time I stepped outside the building, casting long shadows over the sidewalk. The air smelled like rain was coming again. Back at home, I poured a glass of water, stood at the kitchen sink, and stared out into the dark. The campaign they'd started wasn't loud. It was subtle, a line in a comment, a sigh during a phone call, a whisper through people who didn't know better but were quick to repeat what they'd heard. But I didn't answer. I didn't defend. Instead, I gathered what I had. Bank records, transfer histories, screenshots of text threads where Danielle asked for help, claimed it was just temporary, said she'd pay me back. Email receipts from insurance plans, digital invoices, letters from their lender, thanking me for timely payments, all of it organized into folders named by date. I met with our corporate legal department 2 days later. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet meeting behind a closed glass door. I told them what I'd received, the tone of the messages, where they were coming from. I laid out my documentation and let the facts speak for themselves. They thanked me for bringing it in, promised to monitor anything further that might reach into company channels. I walked out of that room steady. By the end of the week, something had shifted. The whispers didn't vanish, but the ones that mattered, the people who had watched me lead meetings, build teams, solve problems, they didn't flinch. The board released a brief statement during the quarterly review. Nothing flashy, just a clear reaffirmation of leadership standards and internal ethics. The message was obvious to those who needed to hear it. I didn't post about it. I didn't comment. I just kept moving. That Friday evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills and the city turned golden, I drove home with the windows cracked open. My phone buzzed once in the passenger seat. I didn't check it. At a red light, I looked out across the lake. The surface was calm. A few boats in the distance, a handful of ducks coasting near the shore. I rested my elbow on the doorframe and exhaled slowly. Whatever story they told from here on out, whatever version they fed to people who wanted to believe it, that wasn't mine to fix anymore. The Monday after the statement went out, the building felt unusually still. Not quiet exactly, just still, like the kind of calm that settles after a long storm. People passed each other in the halls with brief nods, longer glances. A few lingered by the elevators, whispering low, not in alarm, just acknowledgement. The story had shifted. In the days leading up to it, I'd noticed how the tone around me had changed. The smirks were gone. So were the vague, curious questions that hovered just beneath polite conversation. There was no more wondering what had happened, no more guessing. The truth had settled itself in, and people knew. I didn't say anything. I sat in each meeting the way I always had, took notes, gave direction, answered questions. My name had been dragged through quiet back channels and threaded into someone else's version of events, but it hadn't stuck. Because I had done the work, because I had receipts, because I'd never needed to exaggerate my place. That week, 3 separate board members asked to meet privately. Each conversation was short, cordial, respectful. Not one of them brought up the accusations directly, but they thanked me. For transparency, for professionalism, for not escalating. That's when I knew the smear campaign was finished, not because it had been shouted down, but because it had been outlived. I walked out of the office late Thursday night, the last to leave. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, looking out across the lights of the city. The skyline was dark, except for the familiar glow from the municipal tower and the long stretch of buildings along the waterfront. I pulled my coat a little tighter and started toward my car. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. Then again, I waited until I was inside and the engine was running before I checked it. 3 missed calls, 2 voicemails, all from numbers I hadn't seen in weeks. Mom, Dad, Danielle. I didn't play the messages right away. I sat there for a while, letting the car idle, watching a few drops of mist roll down the windshield. Then I opened the first one. My mother's voice was soft, hesitant. "Hi, honey, I know you're busy, but we've been thinking about you, about everything. We'd really like to talk." The second was from my father. "Meredith, I know things got out of hand. Nobody wanted this. You've done a lot for this family, more than we said." Danielle's message was the last. Hey, I didn't know it would go that far. I never wanted anyone to think. Anyway, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I deleted none of them, but I didn't respond either. The next day, another envelope arrived, handwritten again, cream-colored, no return address, my name on the front. Inside was a short letter. No apology, just a few lines. You've made your point. We understand now. Can we try again? Your mother. That evening I drove to the lake, the same spot I used to walk when I first moved back to Tacoma. I parked near the trail and sat on the old bench that looked out over the water. The sun was just beginning to set, the sky painted in long stripes of gold and gray. The water was still. A few ducks drifted in the shallows, barely making a ripple. I pulled the letter from my coat pocket and read it again. Then I folded it neatly and set it beside me on the bench. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt quiet. I'd spent years waiting for them to see me, to notice the effort, the loyalty, the weight I carried without ever being asked. And now, when the truth had spoken for itself, they came forward, not with change, but with careful words. Polished concern, but I didn't need it, because justice had already been served. Not in public, not with fanfare, just in the slow, steady unraveling of the lie. They had tried to erase me, but in the end it was their own image that faded. I went back to the lake one more time before spring gave way to summer. The breeze carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth, and the benches were mostly empty, except for an older couple watching their grandson toss bread to the ducks. I sat a few yards away, hands in my lap, the folded letter still in my coat pocket. The water looked the same as it had a few weeks ago, quiet, steady, unbothered by the storms people brought to its edge. I stayed for a while, watching sunlight scatter across the surface like broken glass. And then, without much thought, I pulled out the old birthday card, the one I had written years ago and never sent, the one filled with hope that maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. The edges were soft, now the ink faded in places where I'd held it too long. I read it once more slowly, then I folded it back up and placed it beside me on the bench. For a moment I didn't move. I just listened, to the wind, to the birds, to the soft laughter of a child calling out for one more piece of bread. And then I stood. As I turned toward the path, a gust of wind caught the edge of the card and lifted it off the bench. I paused, watching it flutter a few feet, then settled gently in the grass. I didn't go after it. Some goodbyes don't need to be spoken. Some are made in silence in the simple act of walking away. I didn't check my phone that day. I didn't go home wondering what they'd say next or how they'd spin the story, because by then I understood. They didn't miss me. They missed the version of me that never asked for anything, that gave without pause, that stayed quiet to keep their image whole. But I wasn't that version anymore. The woman I was now knew when to stay and when to step back, when to hold the door open, and when to close it gently behind her. And that wasn't about anger. It wasn't even about justice. It was about choosing peace over performance, truth over comfort, dignity over being included. That card, like the old stories, the false apologies, the carefully placed photos, it could stay where it landed. I had a new story now, one I didn't have to explain, defend, or shrink for, one where I didn't wait to be invited. I simply arrived as I was. Thank you for listening. If you've ever had to let go of someone to find your peace again, I hope you know you're not alone. And if this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear yours too. Take care of your heart. And if you'd like more stories like this one, feel free to stay a while.